Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Virtual Breakfast today on May 18th. Thank you for joining us. We realize most of you are trying to make a push to get maybe beat the rain in, so we appreciate you still taking some time with us this morning. I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and kick it over to Scott Bales, who is our dry bean specialist here at Michigan State University.
Thanks, Jenna. Thanks for that great introduction. I've pulled up my slides now. Hopefully they look all right. But today we're going to talk about dry bean planting. Seems a little bit hard to imagine on this slightly frosty morning here in Frankenmuth, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Jeff. But today is the 18th of May, and it's time to start thinking about dry beans here. So I'll go over just a few of our take-home points from today's talk. You guys know these are very brief, 15 minutes, but we'll cover just some basic agronomics. Planting, which is the main topic of our discussion here today. We'll go over rates, conditions, and also some other considerations. And then we'll go into, kind of what's more coming down the pipeline, what's our in-season management look like, and we'll also share some helpful tools that we do have for you. So I'll start off with a little bit of a story here. So last winter at a grower meeting, we decided to play a little bit of a game with the folks there in attendance, which is always a little bit nerve-wracking when you're in extension. You never know what's going to be said, but we always learn a lot from those, so I do enjoy doing them. So we went around the room and we found who had been growing dry beans the longest. And we ended up with two different gentlemen that had been raising dry beans for over 60 years. Then we went to them, we handed them the mic, and we asked them what advice did they have for a beginning dry bean grower? What advice would they tell them? How do they become and stay a lifelong dry bean grower? Be successful in that as they had been over the years. And with kind of a joking answer, both of them responded with crop insurance. While we got a good laugh out of the group, and that's funny, and most folks that have raised dry beans do understand the risk of them, I took that as a little bit of a personal mission to help work with growers and kind of take that negative connotation away from edible beans. There's things we can do in the rotation and our production that can help us diversify a little bit, and manage some of that risk a little bit better to help make this a more stable crop for us and a little less high risk reward. And a few of those things that we're going to talk about is, our infrastructure. Our soil is the biggest thing we have, and that is our biggest tool I see, to help us manage risk in season with edible beans. And the biggest thing that we can do there that's the easiest thing is to manage our compaction and also our drainage. We can see we have a map up in the top right that's tiled acres, across the upper Midwest, graphic image of that. And we can see the thumb is fairly well tiled, but we always have those problem spots. And those are the spots that really do drag down our edible bean yields, on a per acre basis, and do cause us those risks. We all know rain is our best friend, but sometimes it's also our worst enemy in edible bean production, as those roots really do not tolerate anoxic or saturated conditions very well. But there's other things we can do too. We can look at our tires on our tractors, making sure we're operating under the right pressure and the right field conditions, trying to look at a little more controlled traffic patterns in our fields, performing tillage when it's essential, but looking at some different tools to hopefully not destroy our soil structure, and also implementing cover crops whenever possible to help maintain that diversity in our structure. There is an interesting quote I have on here too. Our second bullet point there was from Greg Varner in a 1980s publication, that was titled "How to Grow 30 Bag Beans in Michigan," which at the time that was really a high goal for us, and now I like to see that closer to our average. But in that publication, there was a quote that said tile runs no more than 2 rod or 33 feet was essential for 30 bag beans. And I do still believe that rings a little well true. We have some better tools now to understand what our tile needs are, but good drainage is definitely the key to reliable 30 bag beans, I still do believe. And also to stick to our rotation. Dry beans on dry beans is where we run into many issues, and we know it happens occasionally for some reasons, but I really encourage folks to stick to the rotation and maintain that diversity. So just to kind of go over a few of those basic agronomics, things that we know and are a little bit, mute points at this point in the season, but are always good reminders. 3 to 4 year rotations are really best for our disease management in dry beans. Those can look in multiple different ways, corn, dry beans, wheat, including sugar beets. But also we don't want to underlook the benefit of squeezing some cover crops in there when possible, after corn, after wheat, after early dig sugar beets. The more diversity we have in that rotation, I believe the better off we are for our whole rotation as well as dry beans. We have E3465 for variety selection. Varieties have greatly improved in the last 20 years. And I think this is an excellent tool publication from MSU that I work with personally that provides great on-farm data to help us, ensure that we're growing the right market classes and right genetics for our particular farms to set us up for that 30 bag average. Most dry beans in the state are planted into conventional tillage. There's a few reasons for that, including weed control and also ease of stand establishment. And when we're doing that, the PPI herbicide is really our foundation of weed control that sets us up for the year. But I would just add that crop residue is really our friend, especially when inclement weather comes. Whether that's dry and dusty conditions like we had last year, we had some issues with windstorms and soil blowing across the thumb, or it's heavy rainfall to keep that soil from crusting when that sun does come back out. Maintaining some good crop residue in your system is definitely beneficial. As we're looking at potentially another dry stretch of moisture here heading into planting season, as we get closer to our key topic here, it is important to, start considering how do we manage moisture too in those tillage systems, to not overwork that soil and lose that beneficial moisture we have ahead of planting. And then we start thinking about, so when is it time to start planting edible beans and to get serious about this topic? And I really like to rely on soil temps for this. And my kind of personal threshold is 65 degrees and rising, for that 2-inch soil temp. We want to make sure that those soil temps are trending in the right direction, because we can definitely reach 65 earlier in the growing season, but it's not often that we maintain it and keep that soil temp headed up, before that last week of May, first week of June. So I pulled environmental weather here just from the research farm in Frankenmuth yesterday, looking at both our 2 and 4-inch soil temps with our black bar across here at that 65-degree threshold. We see we still have a little ways to go, which is not uncommon. Being the third week of May here, we still have plenty of time, but this is just a little bit of caution. We don't want to get too excited about planting dry beans yet. There's always some folks that hear me say that this time of year and say, well, if we plant our dry beans earlier, we can get them off earlier in better conditions, have an earlier wheat planting date, overall, better system. But there are some considerations that should be had, with that topic. Number one is soil temp that we just discussed. Number two is soil moisture. We really want to make sure our conditions are right, when we're planting dry beans. Sidewall compaction at planting, when things are too wet, is a mistake that we'll see for the rest of the season. Dry beans have a very difficult time, managing that initial compaction. We want to think about our upcoming weather patterns. If we're going to go into a cold, wet pattern, it's probably not something we want to consider. And then we'll kind of circle back to that wheat planting date and rate is definitely always a consideration, in most of our rotations that do include winter wheat. North Dakota did a pretty good job of looking at this topic over 3 years in both pinot, black, and navy beans. They kind of lumped these into 3 average timings, May 13th to May 23rd, which would be early by their standards, May 27th to June 5th, which is more normal, and then late for them, June 12th to June 18th. And these match up fairly well with our planting dates, maybe a touch earlier if I had to, draw a line on the calendar and call them early, mid, and late. And what they found is that plant density, was quite similar across the 3 timings. Seed yield was non-significant across the 3 planting timings across all their locations, trended in the direction of later by about a bag, but not statistically different. Emergence to physiological maturity, so how long that plant actually took to mature once it was up and growing, was pretty well equal across the 3 timings. But the big difference we did see was the number of days from planting to emergence was drastically different across those. You found that when you were on that earlier time, it took over 2 weeks for those dry beans to come up and start growing, which if that was my field of beans, I would not feel very good about that. We know that the sooner we can get dry beans up and growing out of the ground, usually the better off we are for the season, as that's one of our riskiest times of the year for edible bean production. So the earlier we pushed, the longer it did take those to get up, and it really negated most of our benefit, from planting earlier to actually getting those beans matured earlier. It didn't exactly pencil out that way. So we'll move on to planting rates a little bit. So this is an example of a study we did. This one here was in 2022 on the research farm, where we looked at dry bean yield, all planted in 20-inch rows across a bunch of different populations, as low as 50,000 seeds per acre, all the way up to 150,000 seeds per acre. And we can see we found about what we'd expect. You have somewhat of a bimodal curve. As our rates go up from 50, towards 100,000, our yield goes up. You reach a bit of a plateau, and then you do start to drop off a little bit when we get to those really high populations up towards 150. But what we found is we kind of have a key area here from 100 to 130,000 acres, 130,000 seeds per acre, where we have a maximum return on investment. We've maximized our yield potential, but we've also minimized our seed cost. And this has pushed us to keep our standard recommendation for planting rates at 100 to 130,000 seeds per acre when we're in 20 to 22-inch rows, or what I'll commonly refer to as narrow rows for dry beans. There are some quick adjustments we do have. For those planting in 30-inch rows, or what I'd call wide rows, we can pull that recommendation down about 10%. And if we're planting determinate growth types, if we're planting kidney beans, we can pull that down another 10%. So example, if we're planting kidney beans in 30-inch rows, we can pull that recommendation down a total of 20%, from our base of 100 to 130,000 seeds per acre. That was generated with black and navy beans here in the state of Michigan. And some supporting data that we have for that recommendation is I did show the one trial, but there were many trials over 3 or 4 years here in Michigan, and also across other states, which we'll get to a little bit, that have really found that most often emerged populations, actual plants per acre that come up, of 70,000 plants per acre, supported our average yield potential, which I'm going to call less than 35 bags to the acre in those narrow rows. So that's where we generate our planting recommendations of 100 to 130 with that goal of getting 70,000 plants per acre up and growing. After you subtract your germination rates, any issues you have with emergence, with soil crusting, weather patterns, etc. There were some isolated trials where it did show that higher plant populations above 70,000 emerged plants per acre can support above average yields if we're talking above 35 bags to the acre. There's a few caveats with this that I think North Dakota, explained very well. They ran a similar set of trials over 3 years out there in North Dakota, looking at both narrow rows again, in comparison, along with combinations of plant populations across multiple market classes. And what they had found is that the yield advantage that we typically document to narrow rows and increased planting populations, as discussed, was virtually erased in years of high mold pressure without additional management. So basically, when disease came into play, which oftentimes it does, in varying degrees of severity, it basically erased that advantage that we could potentially have from those narrower rows or higher populations. So if that's something that we're considering pushing our populations, or that we're planning on taking advantage of that yield advantage of those narrow rows, white mold is definitely something we need to think about, managing in our rotation, through cultural management or fungicide application programs. So we'll move on to planting depth. This phone call comes every year. How deep should we plant our dry beans? And I'll always respond with to moisture. We really want to ensure that we have those dry beans planted into consistent moisture. The picture here on the bottom right is an example of what happens when we don't. We have a picture here with 3 dry beans up, and then it looks like we've got about a 12-inch skip. And well, this actually isn't a skip by the planter. This is some beans that are actually sitting there in dry dirt when you start to dig around a little bit. And what'll generally happen is we'll get a rainstorm, and you'll get a few tenths of rain that'll bring those beans up. Sometimes it's shortly after planting. In the past couple years, it's been almost 3 weeks to a month before those beans emerged. And you'll actually end up with a little bit of a split crop in the same field, which can cause some quality issues at harvest if it's a large enough area. So we really want to ensure that we have those beans planted at a consistent depth to consistent moisture to bring those beans up together. For overall depth, 1.5 inches is ideal. We can plant as deep as 3 inches, but no more when we're going after that consistent layer of moisture. I will say that dry conditions are generally better than wet, to help avoid some of that sidewall compaction I mentioned earlier. But we really do need to consider upcoming weather patterns too. If we're going to be planting dry beans deep, trying to reach that moisture, we definitely want to make sure that we have 3 to 5 days afterwards with no significant rainfall. Because we all know a heavy rainfall on deep planted dry beans can spell a disaster for our stand. So then I'll make a few comments on field rolling. This is a topic we haven't discussed in a long time, and it's really standard management for us here in Michigan. Nearly all our direct harvested dry beans in Michigan are rolled. Most of us know that this really helps push down our ridges, our stones, our clumps, and really allows our cutter bar to run closer to the soil, have less harvest loss, and also doesn't provide excessive wear from that cutter bar running in those soil conditions. We ran a good number of trials, back in the 2010 to I'd say 2014 era. This one here exampled on screen was here at the research farm in 2013. And basically what we had done is we established a strip trial here with different times of rolling with the same 30-foot roller. So we rolled at a pre-plant timing. We rolled the same day we planted right afterwards. We waited 1 day, we waited 2 days, we waited 4 days, and we also wait till those beans were emerged before we rolled them, had that full unifoliate out, and then rolled the beans. And then, of course, our untreated check is a comparison. And what we'd found, and this was somewhat routine in these types of trials, is that waiting a little bit, 24 hours, seemed to help our yield a little bit, to let that top layer of the soil dry out a little bit, to not pack it quite so hard. Waiting a little bit on our rollers tended to provide yield returns for us. And this isn't the case all the time. It always depends on your soil conditions and how dry and how crusty things are. But it is something to consider that we don't always have to be rushing right out there with a roller directly after planting. We do have a pretty good window there of generally 4 to 5 days before those beans are up if we don't want to roll them emerged, which I generally would caution a little bit because that can be a difficult timing to predict. Of when exactly those beans can be rolled once they're emerged. But generally anywhere in that 1 to 4 days after planting is a pretty safe timing to run that roller. And we'll move into some final planting considerations. And I titled this one Lessons from Dr. Steinke. The dry bean season is too short to really fall behind and not sacrifice yield. And I think Kurt really brings this up well when he says start right to finish well. We only have 90 days to get it right. And fertility is one of those things. Dry beans aren't big users, but we want to make sure everything is in place. We know our soil test P and K levels. We have our nitrogen out there. Our recommendation is 40 to 60 pounds per acre for dry beans. And we want to, make sure everything is in place, prior to starting that season or in our 2x2 at planting to make sure we set that crop up for success. And then, we'll move on a little bit to kind of consider what's coming down the road. And one thing that has come down the road and already here is problem weeds. I have our map on the screen here from our plant and pest diagnostics in 2022, looking at our number of herbicide-resistant weed species per county. In our traditional dry bean production area, and keep in mind, these are just samples that have been submitted to diagnostics, so there are certainly more than that's on here. We have herbicide resistance. This is a problem that's not going to go away. We have a pretty small toolbox in our dry bean herbicide portfolio to use, so we need to make sure we're managing that appropriately. And I really will stand on the pillars of IPM management, or integrated pest management, which is a combination of common sense practices. And by EPA's definition, that's using current information on the life cycle of pests and their interaction with the environment, plus all of our available pest management tools. An example of this in dry beans, is cover crops ahead of the season, followed by an effective burn down, followed by overlapping, residual herbicides is really going to provide us the most effective weed suppression. Examples of this, cultural management over the rotation. Here's a picture I just took last week, 2 weeks ago, here in Frankenmuth. It's a heavy standard rye that's been terminated with an effective burn down. That's then going to be followed by a PPI or pre-herbicide, to really layer that foundation of weed control. Generally, group 3s or 15s would be popular and effective, when we're talking about our problem weeds like horseweed, water hemp, and ragweed. then followed by our effective post. And we need to consider, layering in that additional residual herbicide at that post timing that we do have that label for with Outlook. If we know we're going to be managing weed species like water hemp in season. And if we add all those things together, generally we're going to equal successful, driving management, with those IPM programs. But, we leave one step out of that equation, or sometimes just bad luck. We can have issues like this, which is a field of light red kidney beans that has been virtually overtaken by water hemp, and can happen very quickly, if we do fall behind. So then the last thing I'll mention here is just stay aware of our rising issues in dry beans. The best way to do this is to be in your edible beans. It's great exercise. It's really an enjoyable experience. Walk your beans. Make a habit of being in those fields once a week. Keeping an eye out for insect pests, bacterial diseases, weed escapes, and potentially in-season issues that do pop up. And as you're doing that, we have a whole onslaught of helpful tools for you to use, including the weed control guide, E2904, which is our nutrient recommendations for field crops that does have a dry bean section in it. Our insect management guide by Chris DeFonso that does have a dry bean section as well. We have our 2022 Michigan Dry Bean Research Report that really highlights all of our trials and really innovative practices that we're looking towards. And also, once mold season does come around, I always recommend the Sporecaster app to kind of help validate what you're thinking for your spray timings. Do you need to spray? Do you not need to spray? And kind of provides that third-party thought process. And with that, I'll hand it over to our weather forecast.
All right, now we're to our question answer section. And nobody's dropping questions for us this morning, guys. Everybody's maybe half asleep from working the fields late last night. Either that or you did a stellar job and left no questions to the imagination. That being said, Jeff, you mentioned evapotranspiration being high, and I think I saw Lyndon was on. Lyndon, are you on, and do you have any comments on your irrigation really quick to go along with Jeff's comments? All right. It doesn't sound like he's on, even though I thought I saw him.
Let's try it one more time, Jenna.
Perfect, Lyndon. I can hear you now.
Yeah.
Go for
Yeah,
it.
sorry about that. I'll put in the chat a little article about watering up and watering in. If you're trying to improve germination, break up a crust to help something emerge, trying to get a more even stand. 1/4 inch helps break up that crust. 3/10 or 4/10 in sandy soils to help germinate the seed. A little more water in heavier soils because it takes a little more water to get down further below the seeds so that we're growing into moisture. And then this about the same numbers, 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch if we're going to try to incorporate a herbicide or nitrogen fertilizers. But we've seen quite a few pivots running the last couple days doing those things. The other thing we talked about a week ago, wheat is, for many of us, wheat is pretty much depleted the soil moisture that's out there. There's not a lot of wheat acres, but they're pretty important because they're a rotation with some of our shorter season vegetable crops. So if you have wheat, consider getting that water on there to keep it growing. Make sure that you're not delaying the development and screwing up your seeding practices. And I'll put the articles on those things into the chat.
Perfect. Looks like we have a couple questions that have come in. Scott, I'm going to assume this one's for you. How many fungicide applications for mold would you expect if the conditions continue to be drier than normal?
Yeah, that's always a good question. And it really is a difficult one to give a blanket answer to. Mold is one of those diseases that it really varies from, section to section to field. It's going to depend on what your mold pressure is, where your location is, proximity to the lake often comes into that. Down here, closer to Frankenmuth, if things stay really dry, there'll be some guys that may not benefit from a spray at all. If we have an average year, they generally will benefit from maybe one application, at that late R1 stage. But if we get up in your neighborhood, Jenna, to Harbor Beach, even if it stays drier, there's going to be, dry bean fields that will benefit from 2 applications, just based on that, microclimate that does take place. So that's a good question, and I'd be happy to talk with you about your particular circumstance, if you ever want to shoot me an email or give me a call. But it's kind of a cop out, but it depends.
Well, I could have answered that. All right. Depends on the weather, right? Um,
Exactly.
so the next question we have is with the warmer weather coming later next week, would it be a good opportunity to start planting before the holiday weekend, or is that too early?
Well, I don't believe there's ever such a thing as too early or too late, but kind of comes back to it depends again too. We want to keep an eye on those soil temps. We've got a little bit of ground to make up with. It sounds like our forecast is going to be favorable. If you wait for that 65 degrees and rising soil temperature pattern, if we do have those good dry soil conditions, it's you can't say you're wrong. It's you got to think ahead too. Dry beans typically will flower in 45-ish days after planting. It's going to depend on your soil temps, how quick you get them out of the ground too. We discussed, earlier planting, they're going to be in the ground a little bit longer than our later planted beans, of where that does fall too. There's some old adage that waiting a little bit longer to push flowering later into the summer is beneficial, just based on historical weather patterns. Whether there's truth to that or not, it seems like every year is different. So it's kind of a little bit of a lottery. And I do think a good way to help mitigate that risk is if we have multiple dry bean fields to spread them out. Plant one maybe early, plant one the following week, and one the week after that. And I know it's hard to stop. Once you get that planter rolling, if you can put in so many X number of acres a day, that's what you want to do. You want to get done. You want to get it washed up. You want to put it away. But that is not always the best thing to help mitigate risk.
And just to follow up real quick, Scott and Jenna, given the outlook and given the temperatures and your 65 Fahrenheit average at 2 inches, it's likely most areas we're going to see that certainly by the latter half of next work week. So again, I should have mentioned that earlier, but given the weather outlook, that's a pretty strong likelihood. So watch. You can see that on EnviroWeather, the soil temperatures, but we likely will see that soil temperatures respond pretty quickly next week and go up to those levels.
That's good to hear.
Perfect. I think everybody will be excited to get into the fields if they get everything else done first, Jeff.
Right.
All right. We are slowing down on questions, but I see we have a lot of specialists on today. So, do any of our other specialists have anything they would like to discuss? Chris, any updates on your insects?
I got nothing.
All
Been
right.
pretty quiet, and the flights from north to south, south to north, I haven't detected much. I mean, again, some of that is very patchy when you have to get the rains and the things kind of fall out of those weather fronts. And until that happens, I guess we don't have much movement. There's been a little bit of alfalfa weevil, kind of patchy, and pretty much that's about it.
Perfect. Marty, anything on the disease front?
Nope, things are pretty quiet in terms of wheat. Everything's pretty quiet. We're going to put on flag leaf applications today probably, and some barley head emergence applications, but I don't expect much from those because there's very, very little disease.
Eric has a question. Rye has headed. How many days after rye heading is wheat heading? How many days from wheat flag leaf to heading? Do we have anybody on here who wants to tackle that one?
Yeah, this is Dennis. So I guess I haven't tried to correlate this from rye to wheat, but we have flag leaf emergence across much of the state right now, and we are close to boot stage on some of it. And so once we get to boot stage, it'll just be probably a week, 10 days, and we will be at flowering. So I suspect over the Memorial Day weekend, especially with the warmer temperatures, we'll see some of the early planted wheat starting to flower. So that first week in June will be flowering. This is what I would expect.
Thanks, Dennis. All right, Mike. Soybeans, dry conditions, what you got for us?
Yes, Jenna, very similar to what Scott was saying, but with some differences with soybeans. These dry conditions that are coming in the middle part of the state and south part of the state are starting to create some challenges, some concerns about getting that seed into moisture. We have three scenarios. One would be to plant deeper, as Scott said, try to get into moisture. If you do that, really soybeans shouldn't be planted any deeper than 2.5 inches. That's the absolute maximum for soys. That's a viable option. If you've got row cleaners and you can move some soil out of the way, planting deeper is a viable option. The worst case, and then the other option, viable option, is to plant shallow and make sure that the seed is not into any moisture. And that's a viable option if we've got some rain coming. I don't know, with these dry forecasts, I don't think that 1/4 inch that Jeff is talking about is maybe enough to get them going and keep them going if we do that scenario. So really, I think probably the planting deeper option is probably the best option right now. The worst case scenario, Jenna, is to plant into marginal soil conditions where you've got enough moisture to get the seed germinated, but not enough to keep it going. That is the worst absolute scenario. So the quick and dirty way to tell if you've got enough moisture is you want to plant into about 1/2 inch of good uniform moisture. If you're accomplishing that goal, you're probably going to be okay. If you're planting into hit and miss moisture, that's a really risky scenario.
Mike, what do you consider shallow?
Yeah, I think, 1.5 inches is what we would consider normal across the board planting depth. So shallow, I don't think I'd ever go any deeper than 3/4 to, and 3/4 would be the shallowest I'd ever do it. And the other thing, Phil, that I would mention, I forgot to mention, is that when we're planting into dry conditions, planters are going to perform much better than drills. Let's say you're trying to go down to that, 2.5 inch depth. Your planter is going to be able to do that more uniformly than the drill is. We're just going to get better depth control out of the planter than we are the drills. So I think in marginal conditions, marginally dry conditions, I think the planter is going to perform better.
Perfect. Well, Mike, $100 question here. If the conditions are marginal and we can't control the weather, what is your suggestion then? Should they hold out and wait and put it in dry soil, or go ahead and plant it and let it sit?
The risks in planting, so the riskiest scenario, Jenna, would be to put it into marginal conditions where that you're right on that moisture fringe. Some of the seed's in moisture, some of it's not. So I think we rule that out. We either go deep, and remember, you shouldn't go any deeper than 2.5 inches, or you go shallow into dry soil above that moisture zone. And there's really no risk with that. The only thing you're risking with planting shallower is you're risking the planting delays. You're waiting until you get a rain. You're contingent, unless you're lucky to be down in Lyndon's area and you can irrigate the seed up. That's a no-brainer. Maybe just use that tool. But those of us that don't have that, you're going to be totally dependent on rain to get that up. But at least you're taking advantage of the good planting conditions, and you've got all your seed planted, and it's at really low risk in dry soils.
Perfect. Thank you.
Jen, if I could follow up on Mike's comments, which are great. If we look at the forecast guidance after tomorrow, we probably are not looking at a significant chance for any rainfall for at least a week. Right now, the guess, and this is getting out to the edge of what you can do with any kind of skill, but it would probably be the Memorial Day weekend before we see a chance, of course, in time for the holiday, but to get any kind of a chance. And right now, the guidance suggests that Memorial Day weekend into the early part of that next week would be the next significant chance for any rain. So for those, if they're unlucky and are missed tomorrow, it's going to be at least a week.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, everybody. We're going to give you back a little bit of your time here, it looks like, this morning. So thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Scott, for your time and expertise this morning. They were both excellent. And to all of our specialists who had updates for us, we appreciate them. Thank you for joining us this week, and we look forward to seeing you next week for Virtual Breakfast when Dr. Erin Hill will be presenting on identifying and knowing your problem so you're treating the right thing. Thank you and have a great day.